Ethiopian Bible ranges from 72 books to 81 books, although sometimes counted as 88 books, depending on the canon.
What if the Bible you grew up reading was actually missing 15 books, and one of Hollywood's most controversial filmmakers just called the world's attention to it?
Especially with something like The Passion that I did, the written word was very important because it was, you got all those books, the Bible, you've got the different Gospels and stuff that people are quite familiar.
For centuries, the Ethiopian Bible has remained one of the oldest and most unique versions of Scripture in the world, containing texts and stories that don't appear in most modern Bibles. But now Mel Gibson has stepped into the conversation, and what he's saying is turning heads.
To really tell the story properly, you have to start with the fall of the angels.
From controversial passages to long-debated historical claims, this isn't just about religion, it's about what may have been left out of history altogether.
The Book of Enoch, Chapter 91. After journeying through the heavenly realm and returning to earth, Enoch is preparing to be taken back up into the heavens once again.
If you're ready to explore the truths history tried to hide, hit subscribe and follow along. Who is Mel Gibson, and why does his opinion on Scripture even matter? To understand why Gibson's comments about the Ethiopian Bible spread so fast, you first need to understand who this man is in the context of religious filmmaking, because he's not just an actor with an opinion. Gibson said the script for his upcoming sequel, The Resurrection of the Christ, was written by himself, his brother, and Randall Wallace over a 7-year period. 7 years. That's a level of dedication to biblical research that most people, including most theologians, don't spend. He wasn't just writing a movie, he was studying early Christian history at a serious depth. The Passion of the Christ grossed over $600 million worldwide. He consulted with Vatican scholars, Aramaic language experts, and historians across multiple continents. When a filmmaker with that kind of track record says something about biblical texts, it gets amplified. Because he has consistently demonstrated a genuine commitment to historical and scriptural research, and millions of people trust him for it. In a recent discussion about faith, historical sources, and the textual foundations of Christianity, Gibson referenced the Ethiopian Bible as containing incredible detail about Jesus, detail that many Western Christians may not realize exists. That one comment was enough to send the internet into a complete frenzy. And honestly, once you learn what's actually in that Ethiopian Bible, you begin to understand why. What exactly did Mel Gibson say? Here's where we need to be careful and fair. Gibson made comments referencing the Ethiopian Bible's depth and richness. He pointed to it as a place where Western audiences might find descriptions and narratives about Jesus that are more textured and detailed than what they've encountered in standard Sunday school teachings. According to reporting on the remarks, Gibson, who has long been fascinated by early Christian texts and traditions, emphasized that early Christian communities across Africa preserve text and interpretations that Western audiences rarely explore. There's more detail than people realize, he reportedly noted. That's a measured, thoughtful observation. It's the kind of thing a serious researcher into early Christian history would say. Naturally, the internet translated that into something much more dramatic. Headlines screamed that Gibson was claiming Jesus was secretly described differently and that everything people knew was wrong. Because subtlety is not exactly social media's spiritual gift, the gap between what Gibson reportedly said and what the viral headlines claimed is genuinely enormous. He pointed toward a tradition that scholars have known about for centuries. The internet turned it into a suppressed revelation. When Mel Gibson, known for directing The Passion of the Christ, comments on biblical history, media ecosystems amplify the signal. Religious controversy generates engagement, but engagement is not evidence of new discovery. The Ethiopian Bible has existed in manuscript form for centuries. Scholars have digitized, cataloged, translated, and debated its contents extensively. Academic conferences regularly address Ethiopian textual traditions. So the text isn't new or hidden. What's new is that a famous filmmaker pointed it out, and now millions of people who have never heard of it are suddenly very curious. That curiosity, at least, is completely valid. The Ethiopian Bible time to get into the actual subject of this whole conversation, because the Ethiopian Bible is genuinely extraordinary, and it deserves to be understood properly rather than sensationalized. The Orthodox Tewahedo Biblical Canon is a version of the Christian Bible used in the two Oriental Orthodox churches of the Ethiopian and Eritrean traditions. At 81 books, it is the largest and most diverse biblical canon in traditional Christendom. Let that sink in for a moment. The biggest biblical canon in the entire Christian world belongs to a church in East Africa, and most Western Christians have never heard of it. The Protestant Bible contains 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament, and 27 in the New Testament. In contrast, the Ethiopian Bible includes 81 books, 46 books in the Old Testament, and 35 books in the New Testament. It is written primarily in Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language no longer spoken but still used in liturgy. Ge'ez is a fascinating language in itself. It's essentially a liturgical fossil, preserved specifically because the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has used it in worship for over 1,600 years. The manuscripts that contain these books are among the oldest surviving Christian texts in existence. For centuries, Ethiopian monasteries safeguarded manuscripts through war, invasion, and political upheaval. Handwritten texts on parchment survived in mountain churches, guarded not by institutional bureaucracy, but by generational devotion. The monks who copied and preserved these texts weren't doing it for academic credit. They were doing it because they believed these were sacred words worth protecting with their lives. That's a remarkable act of cultural and spiritual preservation, and it deserves genuine respect. The books that didn't make it into the Western canon. So which books are we actually talking about? What did the Ethiopian church hold on to that the Western churches set aside? Unique to the Orthodox Tewahedo canon are the Paralipomena of Jeremiah, 4 Baruch, Jubilees, Enoch, and the 3 books of Maccabean. These aren't obscure fragments. They are complete, coherent books that were widely read in early Jewish and Christian communities, and some of them are genuinely mind-expanding texts. They cover topics ranging from angelic hierarchies to alternative narratives of familiar biblical stories. Many of these works survive in complete form only in Ge'ez. That's a striking fact. Without the Ethiopian Church's decision to treat these texts as scripture and carefully copy them for generations, they might not exist at all in complete form today. The Book of Enoch is a prime example. The only complete surviving manuscript of 1st Enoch exists in Ge'ez. If the Ethiopian monks hadn't preserved it, that entire text would potentially be lost to history. Ethiopia's early exposure to Christianity, traditionally traced back to the Ethiopian eunuch's conversion in Acts 8:26-39, allowed for the preservation of certain Jewish Christian texts that were not widely accepted elsewhere. This is actually an important historical point. Ethiopian Christianity is genuinely ancient. The faith arrived in that region centuries before most of Europe had even heard of Jesus, and it developed in a way that preserved a wider range of early texts before the Western councils began formally narrowing the canon. The Book of Enoch, the most famous missing text. If there's one book that captures people's imagination more than any other in this discussion, it's the Book of Enoch.
We have a 1st Enoch is a 15th century manuscript written in a version of Ethiopic.
And for good reason, it's extraordinary. Books like First Enoch delve into apocalyptic visions and heavenly hierarchies. To a filmmaker who once directed The Passion of the Christ with unflinching intensity, this is cinematic gold. The Book of Enoch describes fallen angels, detailed heavenly realms, the nature of cosmic judgment, and a figure called the Son of Man who carries remarkable theological significance for understanding the world into which Jesus was born and the language he used.
The Book of Enoch, the Ethiopian, as it says right here, greater than Abraham, holier than Moses, the first perfect human being.
While First Enoch is quoted in Jude 1:14-15, it was not included in the Protestant canon because it was not recognized as inspired scripture by the early church councils.
Qumran, Israel, 1947. 20 miles east of Jerusalem. At this ancient site,
The Protestant position is that the canon is closed and consists only of those books that were universally recognized by the early church as divinely inspired. This is a key point that often gets lost in the viral conversation. The New Testament book of Jude actually quotes directly from First Enoch, meaning the book was being read and considered authoritative by at least some early Christian writers. This doesn't resolve the debate about its canonical status, but it does show that the text wasn't simply unknown or dismissed in early Christianity. Enoch was not included in the biblical canon adopted by most Western churches. In Ethiopia, it remained scripture. This difference often leads to a common misconception that Enoch contains hidden biographical details about Jesus. It does not. It expands theological context, not physical biography. Its value lies in understanding Second Temple Jewish thought, apocalyptic symbolism, and the intellectual world into which Jesus was born.
It teaches that after the flood, the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, half-human giants, became demons.
That distinction matters. It's a nuanced point, but an important one. The Book of Enoch doesn't reveal suppressed facts about Jesus' personal life. It reveals the rich theological landscape that shaped early Christian thought. And that's actually more interesting than any conspiracy theory. The Book of Jubilees, the Little Genesis. Another fascinating text in the Ethiopian canon that gets less.
Scholars call it Little Genesis. But there's nothing little about Jubilees. It's Genesis with the curtain pulled back.
Attention than Enoch, but is equally remarkable, is the Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilee, otherwise known as the Little Genesis, has been preserved entirely only in the Ethiopic version. The whole of Christendom and the learned world owes a debt of gratitude to the Church of Ethiopia for the preservation of those documents. That quote comes from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church's own documentation on their canon, and it captures something genuinely significant. Without Ethiopian monks, this entire text would be gone. Jubilees retells the story of Genesis and Exodus in a different framework. It divides history into periods of 49 years, which are called Jubilees, and adds layers of detail and narrative that aren't present in the standard Genesis account. For biblical scholars, it's an invaluable window into how Jewish communities in the Second Temple period understood their own scripture and history. For general readers, it reads like an expanded director's cut of the familiar creation and patriarchal narratives. The Ethiopian canon develops separately, influenced by early Jewish and Christian traditions in the region of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Church places a strong emphasis on tradition alongside Scripture, whereas Protestantism insists that Scripture alone is the final authority in matters of faith and practice. This distinction affects not only the canon, but also the interpretation and application of biblical teachings. This theological difference is actually the root explanation for why the canons diverged in the first place. It's not about conspiracy or suppression, it's about two different answers to the same question. How does a faith community decide what counts as sacred scripture? the three books of Maccabean. One of the most genuinely distinctive elements of the Ethiopian canon is a set of books that don't appear in any other Christian tradition in the world, the three books of Maccabean. The first, second, and third books of Ethiopian Maccabees are also part of the canon. While they share a common name, they are completely different from the books of Maccabees that are known or have been canonized in other traditions. This is frequently misunderstood. When people hear Ethiopian Maccabees, they assume these are the same texts found in Catholic Bibles. They are not. The Ethiopian Maccabean books are completely separate compositions found nowhere else in the world's biblical traditions. The Maccabean texts deal with themes of faithfulness to God, martyrdom, and the eternal consequences of compromising one's beliefs. They are intensely Ethiopian in their cultural framing, and they represent one of the most striking examples of how this ancient Christian tradition developed its own theological literature independently of Rome, Constantinople, or Jerusalem. These aren't borrowed texts, they're original contributions to the global Christian literary tradition. For Gibson and his team, researching the full scope of early Christian diversity would have led them directly to these texts. The Ethiopian canon isn't just a bigger version of the Western Bible with some extra chapters tacked on, it includes entire books of theology that have no parallel anywhere else in Christendom. That's a remarkable fact that the viral headlines completely miss in their rush toward sensation. How biblical canons actually form one of the most important things to understand in this whole conversation is that the Bible didn't arrive from heaven already packaged with a table of contents. The process of deciding which books count as scripture took centuries and involved real historical, political, and theological debates. Ancient Christianity was not monolithic. Communities in Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, and Axum developed liturgical and textual traditions that reflected regional theological priorities. The Ethiopian Church, historically linked to early Christianity through trade and diplomacy, developed partly outside the direct influence of later Western church councils. As a result, its canon retained certain texts that Western Christianity did not universally adopt. This is simply how history unfolded. Different communities developing their faith in different geographic and cultural contexts made different decisions about which texts were authoritative. Ethiopian Christianity, shaped by its own linguistic, political, and cultural realities, finalized a canon reflecting its spiritual heritage. This diversity is well established in academic research. It is not hidden. It is taught in seminaries worldwide. The word hidden is the most misleading term in this entire viral conversation. These texts are available. They've been translated. Scholars have written extensively about them. The Ethiopian Church's own website lists all 81 canonical books. Nothing was hidden. It just wasn't in the curriculum for Western Sunday school. No vault was opened. No doctrine was overturned. No suppressed teaching was unearthed. What emerged instead is renewed curiosity about one of the oldest Christian traditions on earth. And that renewed curiosity, even if it was triggered by viral hype, is actually a genuinely good thing. More people are now interested in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, its history, its manuscripts, and its canon than at any previous point in the internet age. That's a meaningful cultural outcome. The Garima Gospels. If you want to understand just how genuinely ancient the Ethiopian Christian tradition is, there's one artifact that makes the point more powerfully than any argument. The Garima Gospels, for example, are believed to date back to around the 5th or 6th century. That is not a Hollywood myth. That is a documented scholarship. The Garima Gospels are considered among the oldest surviving illustrated Christian manuscripts in the world. They have been carbon dated, examined by manuscript scholars, and confirmed to be extraordinary survivals from a period when most of Europe was still in the early stages of Christian conversion. These manuscripts are kept at Abba Garima Monastery in northern Ethiopia's Tigray region, one of the oldest monasteries in the world. The monks there have been preserving these texts through invasions, civil wars, droughts, and political upheaval for over 1,500 years. The level of commitment required to maintain that continuity of preservation across 15 centuries is almost impossible to comprehend. What this tells us about the Ethiopian Bible conversation is important. This isn't a tradition that invented itself recently or manufactured ancient credentials. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has genuine, archaeologically verified roots stretching back to the earliest centuries of Christian history. When they say their canon preserves early texts, they have the manuscripts to back it up. The history is real and it's deep. Gibson's upcoming film, and why this conversation is happening now. So why is all of this coming up right now in 2026? The timing isn't random, it connects directly to what Gibson is currently working on. The Resurrection of the Christ. Part 1 is an upcoming American epic biblical drama film directed by Mel Gibson. It is the second installment in a trilogy and the sequel to The Passion of the Christ from 2004. Principal photography began on October 6, 2025, with the film to be shot at Cinecittà Studios in Rome. After nearly a decade in development, Gibson's sequel is actually being made, and the scope of it is enormous. This is no small follow-up film. Gibson described the film as very ambitious and said the narrative moves from the fall of the angels to the death of the last apostle. Think about that range. From the fall of the angels to the death of the last apostle. To tell a story with that kind of cosmic scope, accurately and authentically, you would absolutely need to research texts beyond the standard 66-book Protestant canon. The Book of Enoch, with its detailed angelology and its accounts of fallen angels and heavenly hierarchies, would be directly relevant to a film attempting to portray those events visually. Sources close to his production team for The Resurrection of the Christ have indicated that Gibson has been studying pre-Nicene texts extensively, including Ethiopian manuscripts, as part of his research into what Jesus said and did during the 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension, the very period that certain texts claim to cover in detail. Whether or not this research directly influences the film, it explains why Gibson has been engaging with the Ethiopian canon and why his comments about it carry weight. He's not casually Googling ancient scripture, he's doing serious pre-production research for what may be the most ambitious religious film ever attempted. What scholars actually say now. Here's where it's important to pause and think clearly, because the excitement around this topic has moved far ahead of what scholars actually say. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserved manuscripts that were never truly lost. They've long been known, studied, and even translated. What's new isn't the discovery, but the attention. While viral narratives frame this as shocking, historians and biblical scholars were never surprised. These texts have always been part of the historical record. What they offer isn't a radical rewrite of Christianity, but added depth, expanding themes like angels, judgment, and symbolism while leaving core beliefs intact. Rather than exposing a hidden secret, the Ethiopian canon gives us a broader, richer view of early Christian thought. And while that may sound less sensational, it's actually far more fascinating. A 1,600 years old tradition preserving texts that might have otherwise been lost, standing as a powerful example of cultural and religious continuity. What this means for everyday believers and curious minds. After all, what does this really mean for ordinary people curious about faith or history? For scholars, the Ethiopian canon provides a rare glimpse into the diversity of early Christianity, while for believers it raises thoughtful questions about whether spiritual authority comes from tradition, formal canonization, or simple preservation. Many theologians argue that these texts enrich Christian theology rather than contradict it, showing that a broader canon doesn't invalidate narrower ones, but instead invites deeper discussion about how communities decide what is sacred and why. For those simply fascinated by history, the story itself is remarkable. A 1,600 years old church, monasteries perched on cliffs, and hand-copied manuscripts preserved through centuries of war and change in a language no longer spoken daily. And this isn't just distant history. English translations of books like the Book of Enoch and Book of Jubilees are widely available, along with compiled versions of the 81-book canon and extensive academic research. In that sense, the debate sparked by Mel Gibson has done something genuinely valuable. It has drawn global attention to one of the world's oldest Christian traditions, encouraging people to explore and understand it on its own terms rather than as a footnote to modern controversy. The Ethiopian Bible is real, ancient, and genuinely extraordinary, containing 81 books, including texts like Enoch and Jubilees that survive in complete form nowhere else on earth. Mel Gibson's comments brought it to millions of people's attention, and while the viral versions ran way hotter than the facts support, the underlying story is one of the most remarkable tales of cultural and spiritual preservation in human history. Nothing was hidden. The world just wasn't paying attention. Now tell me, does a 1,600 years old tradition preserving books the Western Church set aside change how you see Scripture? Share your thoughts below.